Hello and welcome to the program. I am Suren. Do you follow a religion? Do you believe in God? People from the very beginning, when life, that is human life, began on earth, faced with unexplainable occurrences or happenings, and wanted to believe in something that made them possible. They dreamt or imagined in their own logical terms that if there was something, then there had to be something else, making it possible. They could not explain what fire was, what the sun was, what the moon meant, what night could present, and what life was all about. Death and dying was an important issue, and so creating, philosophically at least, an invisible entity or entities who were responsible in making man in their own image and making laws and regulations for them to follow to live a good life. That worked for a while, for several centuries, and men were controlled under the dictates of priesthood and their kings and queens who followed the same dictates. And so their religions were born. And now, as with their typical human characteristics, they had to be supreme in everything. Battlements and wars were conducted. Bloodshed was the game of the day for centuries, just to prove their own supremacy. Indeed, religion was born and became ripe. That is what we know now, and can discover to be the case, although many would deny the effects thereof. For it would be very painful to not accept what they have been guided to for centuries, and believing in all the things the churches, temples, and other religions have taught them for a long time now. Let us now look at this issue in a timely fashion, shall we? There are people who believe in a God and convinced that they can prove it. That there are also those who believe in nothing and claim they also can prove the non-existence of a God. Personally, I prefer not to dwell on an idea which cannot be proven. However, considering the both sides of the coin may be a reasonable issue. As the study furnished with the known encyclopedias, shall we say, indicate, we can, for example, discover, as it was reviewed on 27th of March 2025, the existence of God is a subject of debate in the philosophy of religion and theology. A wide variety of arguments for and against the existence of a God, with the same or similar arguments also generally being used when talking about the existence of multiple deities, can be categorized as a logical, empirical, metaphysical, subjective, or even scientific considerations. In the philosophical terms, however, the question of the existence of God involves the disciplines of epistemology, which is the nature of scope of knowledge, and ontology, which is the study of the nature of being or existence, and the theory of value, since we all tend to believe some definitions of God that include, listen to this, perfection. It is indicated that the Western tradition of philosophical discussion of the existence of God began with Plato and Aristotle, who made arguments for the existence of a being responsible for fashioning the universe, also referred to as the demiurge or the unmoved mover, that today would be categorized as the cosmological arguments. Other arguments for the existence of God have been proposed by Saint Anselm, who formulated the very first ontological argument. Thomas Aquinas, who presented his own version of the cosmological argument in the first way. René Descartes, who said that existence of a benevolent God is logically necessary for the evidence of the senses to be meaningful. John Calvin argued for a sensus divinitatis, which gives each human the knowledge of God's existence. On the other hand, Islamic philosophers who developed arguments for the existence of God comprise Averroes, who made arguments influenced by Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, Al-Ghazali and Al-Kindi, who presented the proof of the truthfulness, and Al-Farabi, who made Neoplatonic arguments. In philosophy, and more specifically in the philosophy of religion, atheism refers to the proposition that God does not exist. Some religions, such as Jainism, reject it for any possibility thereof for a creator deity. Some philosophers, on the other hand, who have provided arguments against the existence of God include David Hume, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Bernard Russell. Theism, the proposition that God exists, is the dominant view among philosophers of religion. It is therefore worth considering that in a 2020 PhilPapers survey, 69.50% of philosophers of religion stated that they accepted while leaning towards theism, and 19.86% stated that they accepted while leaning towards atheism. Now, prominent contemporary philosophers of religion who defended theism include Alvin Plantings, Eugene Nagasawa, John Hick, Richard Swinburne, and William Lane Craig, while those who defended atheism include Graham Oppy, Paul Draper, Quentin Smith, J. L. Mackey, and J. L. Schellenberg. Positions on the existence of God can be divided along numerous axes, producing a variety of orthogonal classifications. Theism and atheism are positions of belief or lack of it. Gnosticism and agnosticism are positions of knowledge or the lack of it. Agnosticism concerns, however, in the belief about God's conceptual coherence. Apathism or apatheism concerns with the belief about the practical importance of whether God exists at all. For the purposes of discussion, Richard Dawkins described 7 milestones on his theistic probability. What is theism? The Catholic Church, following the teachings of the Apostle Paul, as in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Thomas Aquinas, and the First Vatican Council, affirms that God's existence can be known with certainty from the creative world by the natural light of human reason. Traditional religious definitions of God, is classical theism. God is characterized in there as the metaphysically ultimate being, the first timeless, absolutely simple and sovereign being who is devoid of any anthropomorphic qualities, in distinction to other conceptions such as theistic personalism, open theism, and process theism. Real. Classical theists do not believe that God can be completely defined. They believe it would contradict the transcendent nature of God for mere humans to define him. Robert Barron explains by analogy that it seems impossible for a two-dimensional object to conceive of three-dimensional humans. Interesting point. In modern Western societies, the concepts of God typically entail a monotheistic, supreme, ultimate, and personal being, as found in the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions. In monotheistic religions outside the Abrahamic traditions, the existence of God is discussed in similar terms. In these traditions, God is also identified as the author, either directly or by inspiration, of certain texts, and that certain texts describe specific historical events caused by the God in question, or communications from God, whether in direct speech or via dreams or omens. Some traditions also believe that God is the entity which is currently answering prayers for intervention or information or opinions. Many Islamic scholars have used philosophical and rational arguments to prove the existence of God, Allah. For example, Ibn Rashid, a 12th century Islamic scholar, philosopher and physician, stated that there are two arguments worthy of adherence, both of which are found in what he calls the precious book, namely the Holy Quran. Rashid cites providence and invention in using the Quran's parables to claim the existence of God, Allah. Rashid argues that the Earth's weather patterns are conditioned to support human life. Thus, if the planet is so finely tuned to maintain life, then it suggests a fine-tuner, namely God. The sun and the moon are not just random objects floating in the Milky Way. Rather, they serve as day and night, and the way nature works, and how life is formed. Humankind benefits from it. Rashid essentially comes to a conclusion that there has to be a higher being who has made everything perfectly to serve the needs of human beings. Moses ben Maimon, widely known as Maimonides, was a Jewish scholar who tried to logically prove the existence of God. Maimonides offered proofs for the existence of God, but he did not begin with defining God first, like many others do. Rather, he used a description of the earth and the universe to prove the existence of God. He talked about the heavenly bodies and how they are committed to eternal motion. Maimonides argued that because every physical object is finite, it can only contain a finite amount of power. If everything in the universe, which includes all the planets and the stars, is finite, then there has to be an infinite power to push for the no motion of everything in the universe. Narrowing down to an infinite being, the only thing that can explain the emotion is an infinite being, meaning God, which is neither a body nor a force in the body. Maimonides believed that this argument gives us a ground to believe that God is, not an idea of what God is. He believed that God cannot be understood or be compared. What about the non-personal definitions of God? Have you considered? In pantheism, God and the universe are considered to be the same thing. In this view, the natural sciences are essentially studying the nature of God. This definition of God creates the philosophical problem that a universe with God and one without God are the same, other than the words used to describe it. That's another interesting consideration. Now, deism and pantheism assert that there is a God distinct from, or which extends beyond, either in time or in space or in some other way, the universe. However, these positions deny that God intervenes in the operation of the universe, including communicating with humans personally. Consider, The notion that God never intervenes or communicates with the universe, or may have evolved into the universe, as in pantheism, makes it difficult, if not by definition impossible, to distinguish between a universe with God and the one without. The Ethics of Baruch Spinoza gave two demonstrations of the existence of God. The God of Spinoza is uncaused by any external force and has no free will. It is not personal and anthropomorphic. Debate about how theism should be argued upon. In Christian faith, theology, and philosopher, Thomas Aquinas made a distinction between A. Preambles of faith and B. Articles of faith. The preamble include alleged truths containing revelation which are nevertheless to demonstrate the demonstrable by reason, e.g., the immortality of the soul, the existence of God. The articles of faith, on the other hand, contain truths that cannot be proven or reached by reason alone, and presuppose the truth of the preamble, e.g., in Christianity, the Holy Trinity is not demonstrable and presupposes the existence of God. The argument that the existence of God can be known to all, even prior to exposure to any divine revelation, predates Christianity. The Apostle Paul made this argument when he said that pagans were without excuse because since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. In this, Paul alludes to the proofs for a creator, later enunciated by Thomas Aquinas and others, that had also been explored by the Greek philosophers. Another apologist called school of thought, including Dutch and American Reformed thinkers, such as Abraham Kuyper, Benjamin Warfield, and Herman Dooyeweerd, emerged in the late 1920s. The school was instituted by Cornelius van Til and came to be popularly called a presuppositional apologetics, though van Til felt transcendental would be more accurate title. The main distinction between this approach and a more classical evidentialist or evidentialist approach is that the prepositional one denies any common ground between the believer and the non-believer, except that which the non-believer denies, namely the assumption of the truth of the theistic worldview. In other words, presuppositionalists do not believe that the existence of God can be proven by appeal to raw, uninterpreted, or brute facts, which have the same, just theoretical, meaning to people with fundamentally different worldviews because they deny that such a condition is even possible. They claim that the only possible truth for the existence of God is that the very same belief is the necessary condition to the intelligibility of all other human experience and action. Now, they attempt to prove the existence of God by means of appeal to the transcendental necessity of the belief, indirectly by appeal to the Protestant Christians. And note that the Christian faith teaches salvation is by faith, and that faith is the reliance upon the faithfulness of God. The most extreme example of this position is called fideism or fideism, which holds that faith is simply the will to believe and argues that if God's existence were rationally demonstrable, faith in its existence would become superfluous. Suren Kierkegaard argued that objective knowledge, such as 1 + 1 = 2, is important to existence. If God rationally be proven, his existence would be unimportant to humans. It is because God cannot ratify being proven that his existence is important to us. In the justification of knowledge, Calvinist theologian Robert L. Raymond argues that believers should not attempt to prove the existence of God, since he believes all such proofs are fundamentally unsound. Believers should not place their confidence in them, much less resort to them in discussions with non-believers. Rather, they should accept the content of revelation by faith. Raymond's position is similar to that of his mentor Gordon Clark, which holds that all worldviews are based on certain unprovable first premises or axioms, and therefore are ultimately unprovable. The Christian theist, therefore, must simply choose to start with Christianity rather than anything else by a leap of faith. This position is also sometimes called prepositional apologetics, but should not be confused with the Fantillian variety. Let us now consider atheism. In the philosophy of religion, atheism is standardly defined as the metaphysical claim that God does not exist. In 1972, Anthony Flew proposed defining atheism as the psychological state of lacking any belief in God. However, Flew's definition is usually rejected due to the need for a name for the direct opposite proposition to theism, the metaphysical claim that God does exist. There are varieties also to atheisms. Positive atheism, for instance. Positive atheism, also called strong atheism or hard atheism, is a proposed form of atheism that asserts that no deities exist. That's it. The strong atheist explicitly asserts the non-existence of gods. Negative atheism. Negative atheism, also called weak atheism and soft atheism, is a proposed form of atheism other than positive, wherein a person does not believe in the existence of any deities, but does not explicitly assert there to be none. Agnosticism, that's an interesting point. Agnosticism is the view that the trust value of certain claims, especially claims about the existence of any deity, but also other religious and metaphysical claims, is unknown or unknowable. Agnosticism does not define one's belief or disbelief in gods. Agnostic may still identify themselves as theists or atheists. The theologian Robert Flint explains thus: if a man have failed to find any good reason for believing that there is a God, it is perfectly natural and irrational that he should not believe that there is a God. And if so, he's an atheist. Although he assumes no superhuman knowledge, but merely the ordinary human power of judging of evidence. If we go further, and after an investigation into the nature of human knowledge, ending in the conclusion that the existence of God is incapable of proof, cease to believe in it on the ground that he cannot know it to be true. He is an agnostic and also an atheist, an agnostic atheist, an atheist because an agnostic. Philosophical issues. Now, the problem of the supernatural. One problem posed by the question of the existence of God is that traditional beliefs usually describe the gods' various supernatural powers. Supernatural beings may be able to conceal and reveal themselves for their own purposes, as, for example, in the detail of Baucis and Philemon. In addition, we also discover that according to concepts of God, God is not part of the natural order, but the ultimate creator of nature and of the scientific laws. Thus, in the philosophy, God is viewed as part of the explanatory structure needed to support scientific conclusions, and any powers of God possesses are, strictly speaking, of the natural order that is derived from God's place as originator of nature. In Karl Popper's philosophy of science, belief in a supernatural God is outside the natural domain of scientific investigation, because all scientific hypotheses must be falsely believed in or viewed for Aristotelian ways in the natural world. The non-overlapping magisteria view proposed by Stephen J. Gould also holds that the existence or otherwise of God is irrelevant to and beyond the domain of science. Scientists follow the scientific method, within which theories must be verifiable by physical experiment. The majority of prominent conceptions of God explicitly or effectively posit a being whose existence is not testable, either by proof or disproof. Therefore, the question of God's existence may lie outside the purview of modern science by definition. The Catholic Church maintains that knowledge of the existence of God is the natural light of human reason. Philaists, on the other hand, maintain that belief in God's existence may not be amenable to demonstration or refutation, but rests on faith alone. That's it. Logical positivists such as Rudolf Carnap and A.J. Ayer viewed any talk of gods as literal nonsense. For the logical positivists and appearance of similar schools of thought, statements about religious or other transcendent experiences cannot have a truth value and are deemed to be without meaning, because such statements do not have any clear verification criteria. As the Christian biologist Scott C. Todd put it, even if all the data pointed to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. This argument limits the domain of science to the empirically observable and limits the domain of God to the empirically unprovable. Let us now consider the nature of relevant proofs and arguments. John Polkinghorne suggests that the nearest analogy to the existence of God in physics is the ideas of quantum mechanics, which are seemingly paradoxical but makes sense of a great deal of disparate data. Alvin Plantinga compares the question of the existence of God to the question of the existence of other minds, claiming both are notoriously impossible to prove against the determined skeptic. One approach suggested by writers such as Stephen D. Unwin is to treat particular versions of theism and naturalism as though they were two hypotheses in the Bayesian sense, to list certain data or alleged data about the world, and to suggest that the likelihood of these data are significantly higher under one hypothesis than the other. Most of the arguments for or against the existence of God can be seen as pointing to particular aspects of the universe in this way. In almost all cases, it is not serious as suggested by proponents of the arguments that they are irrefutable, merely that they make one worldview seem significantly more likely than the other. However, as we discover, since an assessment of the weight of evidence depends on the prior probability that is assigned to each worldview arguments that theorist finds convincing may seem thin to an atheist, and vice versa. Philosophers such as Wittgenstein take a view that is considered anti-realist and oppose philosophical arguments related to God's existence. For instance, Charles Taylor contends that the real is whatever will not go away. If we cannot reduce talk about God to anything else, or replace it, or prove it false, then perhaps God is as real as anything else. Existence in absolute truth is central to Vedanta epistemology. In the traditional sense, perception-based approaches were put into question as possibly misleading due to frequently superposed ideas. But through all object cognition can be doubted. The existence of the doubt remains effective until in Nastika traditions, in Mayavada schools following Adi Shankara. The 5 eternal principles to be discussed under ontology, beginning with God or Isvara, the ultimate reality cannot be established by means of logic alone, and often require superior proof. In Vaishnavism, Vishnu, or his intimate ontological form of Krishna, is equated to the personal absolute God of the Western traditions. Aspects of Krishna as Svayam Bhagavan in original absolute truth, Sat Chit Ananda, are understood originating from 3 essential attributes of Krishna's form, i.e., eternal existence, or Sat, related to the Brahman aspect, knowledge, or Chit, to the Paramatman and bliss, or Ananda in Sanskrit, to Bhagavan. The argument from evolution against God's existence is a philosophical argument that attempts to prove the non-existence of God by using the theory of evolution. The argument is based on the idea that the theory of evolution provides a natural explanation for the diversity of life on Earth, and therefore there is no need to invoke a divine creator. Several authors have offered psychological or sociological explanations for the beliefs in the existence of deities. Psychologists observed that the majority of humans often ask existential questions such as why we are here and whether life has a purpose. Some psychologists have posited that religious beliefs may recruit cognitive mechanisms in order to satisfy these questions. William James, for instance, emphasized the inner religious struggle between melancholy and happiness and pointed to trance as a cognitive mechanism. Sigmund Freud stressed fear and pain, the need for a powerful parental figure, the obsessional nature of ritual and hypnotic state of community can induce as contributing factors to the psychology of religion. There we end today's program until we meet you again by the next episode. Until then, keep smiling and be happy. And be happy, in fact, always. Thank you.